Okay, we are recording. So I'm here to talk with you today about US Soviet and US Russian space cooperation, which is something that you have a very personal experience with. You commanded STS-60, which was the first mission of the Shuttle-Mir program in 1994. So I just was hoping you could talk about, first of all, just going into that, what was your first reaction to hearing I'm going to be commanding a mission with cosmonauts?
Uh, you really want to know my first reaction?
Yes.
I'll set it up. I was actually back in Washington D.C. This was after my second flight on the shuttle. I had actually flown what was STS-45. That was NASA's first what we call mission to planet Earth, and that was 1992. And then I was almost immediately brought to Washington because we had a new NASA administrator, Dan Golden, and he brought me up to be the deputy to the deputy. So I was the assistant deputy administrator, and I hated it. I hated every day at NASA headquarters and in Washington, and I just couldn't wait to get back. And suddenly one day they came in and said, "Hey, how would you like to go back to Houston and command one more shuttle mission?" I said, "I'd be delighted." And at the time, we had not flown the first mission to service the Hubble Space Telescope. So since I had left it, my crew and I had left it up there in less than good condition, I figured a great end to my NASA career would be to command the first servicing mission to Hubble. And I asked if that was it, and they said, "No, unfortunately not. We've already picked that crew. We've got something even better." And I said, "Okay, what could be better?" And they said, "Well, we're going to fly a Russian cosmonaut on shuttle, and it'll be a test for whether or not we can collaborate with them and fly some astronauts to Mir, and then maybe work with them on in the future." And my immediate answer was, "Forget it. I'm a Marine, and I've trained all my life to fight them, and they've trained all their life to fight me, and I don't want to fly with any damn Russian." And so that was my immediate reaction. And my boss said, "Okay, thanks a lot for your input. Why don't you calm down? And the two guys that are going to train are here in the U.S., and they're going to have dinner with Donna and David Bartow, who were friends of mine. David had previously flown on shuttle as a payload specialist, and they said, 'Why don't you just go over and sit and listen and come back and tell me what you think tomorrow?' And so I did reluctantly, and I walked in and I met Sergei Krikalev, with whom I ended up flying. He was the younger of the two. He was not a military person. He was a civilian engineer who was a Russian aerobatics champion. And at the time, he actually had more time in space than any other Russian because he had been on board Mir when the Soviet Union fell apart. So when he left, it was the Soviet Union. When he came back, it was Russia. And his hometown had gone from Leningrad back to St. Petersburg, all in one flight. As it turned out to be, his backup was Vladimir Titov. Vladimir was the consummate Russian cosmonaut, a veteran MiG-21 pilot, held the record at the time for the longest single space flight, which was 366 days at that time on board Mir. So he had the shortest and the longest flights on Mir. His first flight had lasted a number of seconds because they had been ejected from the launch pad due to a pad fire. And he and his two crew members the capsule had ejected them across the Russian steppe or the Kazakh steppe, and they landed safely. And that was the end of his first flight. Didn't even get close to space. So I went, and almost immediately after the cursory introductions, the conversation turned to families. And we each talked about families. My son and daughter at the time, I think, my son was actually a senior in high school. My son was a senior at the Naval Academy. My daughter was getting ready to leave high school and go to Spelman College. So, I had the older kids. Sergei, with whom I flew, had one daughter, Olga, who was 4. Vladimir had 2 kids, Yuri, who was 8 at the time, and Marina. Marina had already left Russia and had gone to Houston ahead of her father and had enrolled in San Jacinto Junior College and had started taking business courses because she really wanted to get into international business. She spoke fluent English. Sergei spoke fluent English. Nobody else in that whole crowd spoke any English. So that was what we were going to get. But we spent the night talking about our family, our kids, what we wanted the world to be like for them. And by the time the evening was over, I think we were all of like minds for, what we wanted to do on our mission and what we wanted to accomplish for the world and all that kind of stuff. And I went in the next day and said, I'm in. I'll do this. And it turned out to be, for me and my family, perhaps it was without a doubt the best 2 years that we spent in our 20 years with NASA, because we brought these two families over from Moscow, just immersed them in this incredibly hostile culture, because it was nothing at all like Moscow being in Houston, Texas. And but they adjusted incredibly well. Olga learned English over time. Yuri was speaking pretty good English after about 6 months in third grade, and already had a big cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and a big belt buckle. And like I said, Marina had already come ahead and had done everything. But helping them to get accustomed to living and working in the United States, we actually we started out with them in apartments, and that just didn't work at all. We finally realized that after a couple of days that was not the introduction that we wanted to have them have to the United States, was apartment living. And so we managed to find two homes, single family dwellings. One was in Clear Lake and one was in a neighboring city called Friendswood. And so that way they got a taste of a variety of Texas. And their kids all enrolled in public schools. And so they got it deeply. And they lived with us for about 1.5 years. And, they stayed there while we flew. And when we came back, we did our debriefs and everything. And then they started packing up to go back to Moscow. But our families became very close. Now, after 20 some odd years, we're still very good friends. I stay in touch mostly with Sergei because he is still with Roscosmos. He runs their human spaceflight program. And we were able to work collaboratively through, I want to say 3 or 4 different heads of Roscosmos while I was the NASA administrator. I was there for 8 years. So I saw heads of Roscosmos come and go, but Sergei was the constant. And he had come all the way from being the head of the Russian cosmonaut program at one time. That didn't really work out because he was truly not a military kind of guy. And their program is still more generated toward the military. But anyway, so that was my first experience with the Russians. And I came out of it deeply impressed and with a lifelong set of friends, and my family with lifelong friends. So long answer to your short question.
No, that's really amazing. I mean, I think that you managed to find so quickly too that, human connection past the giant history of the Cold War, especially for you coming from a military background. I mean, I think that's amazing that all it really took was just, one meeting.
But I will tell you though, as I look back on it, it wasn't just that. Tom Stafford, General Tom Stafford, who was quite a military person himself and spent, a lifetime on active duty in the Air Force, both before and after serving as a NASA astronaut, and is no particularly friend of Russia, but became closely associated with his later lifetime friend, General Alexei Leonov. They flew on the very first joint Soviet-American mission, Apollo Soyuz. And they had the same experience that we had, that once you met the person, the human being, and their families, and started talking about mutual goals in life, and working toward the completion of a mission, things changed dramatically. And so he and Alexei Leonov became lifelong friends. Their families adore each other and stay in touch and all that kind of stuff. So Tom was a big help to me as I, tried to help people get adjusted to having Russians in Houston and everything, because we had a larger cadre of Russians for our program than Tom had for Apollo Soyuz, because it was a pretty quick Apollo-Soyuz was pretty hurriedly put together, and it was nothing at all like ours. We had spent a long time in preparation. We ended up bringing about, I don't know, probably 100, 200 Russians to Houston to live and work, because we brought members of their training team, members of the medical crew, members of their flight control team, and they all sort of meshed in with the NASA folk, so that we would have an opportunity to pick each other's brain and find out how we operated and how we could best work together to conduct this mission.
Were there any sort of cultural language issues between the two sides with such large people?
Yeah, it's a silly one, and you know, to my recollection, we didn't have any dramatic cultural differences that impeded progress of integrating the teams or getting people trained or anything. They were they were tangible, concrete issues like language. Not everybody spoke English, and almost none of our people spoke Russian. We were just beginning to introduce Russian as a language option for astronauts. Prior to this, we didn't have any language training because we were working with foreign entities, but not where we were going to be crew members. And so there's a company called TechTrans International that still does all of the translation, interpretation, and training for NASA down in Houston. But TechTrans tried to help my crew learn a little Russian. Some of them did much better than others of us. I am not good with languages at all, and so I learned Privyet and Da and Yet, and that's about it. So I could ask for a piva, a beer, if that's it. I don't even remember anymore. But that was about it. That was the extent of my Russian. They seemed to do very well in adapting. They learned language, they learned English, or they learned it well enough to get along. And so I think culturally, it had more to do with customs and traditions and superstitions. I learned about it the hard way. And it was long after my flight. I had never encountered it before, but when I was the NASA administrator, I went over for, it was a mission to ISS when Guy Le Liberator, the founder of Cirque du Soleil, Guy trained and flew to station as a spaceflight participant. And so he had lived in Moscow in Star City for about a year. And I was there for his launch. I forget who the American was that was flying with him, because he was the big celebrity. But the night before the launch, we were at a big dinner party, and I rose and proposed a toast to the success of this mission, and the room fell silent. And I looked around knowing that I had said something wrong. I just didn't know what it was. And someone sprang to their feet pretty quickly and tried to re-wicker what I had said to take the wishing luck to people out of this, because it was super, you may know this, but it was a bad omen and a bad superstitious belief that when you wished luck to someone or somebody before the event, it almost definitely spelled their doom. And so I had committed a cultural faux pas on my very first trip to Russia as the NASA administrator. They forgave me for it, but I remember that forever, to be quite honest. So I'd say that was the biggest thing, was cultural things, like peeing on the wheel of the launcher, that takes Soyuz out to the launch pad. That everything that Yuri Gagarin did became set in stone. And so allegedly Yuri Gagarin needed to go to the bathroom on his way out to the vehicle for his launch, and he stopped and unzipped his spacesuit and his launch suit and peed on the wheel. So every cosmonaut after that had to stop and pee on the wheel because Yuri did it. And there are any number of other customs and traditions that Yuri did that everybody, whether you're American or Russian or whatever, you do as a part of your preparation and flight.
Yeah, I've spoken with astronauts who have said that for them, learning Russian is the hardest part of being an astronaut.
It's a very difficult language to grasp.
Yeah, as someone who has studied Russian, I understand that. Did you find a lot of institutional issues between the Russian Space Agency and NASA?
Yeah, and in particular, one of the ones that really stood out for us, and we were never able to overcome, was because cosmonauts are not paid very well, particularly in relation to American astronauts. You know, we have people whose salaries run the gamut from you know, a lieutenant in the Navy all the way up to a captain or an admiral in the Navy. So you've got a wide span of income. Cosmonauts are pretty much lumped right in the middle, and they live on their supplemental income. And their supplemental income comes from selling everything, whether it's blood, urine, saliva samples. So from the standpoint of medical research, that was the biggest hurdle for us to overcome, some of which we never overcame. For example, we could not get, because we couldn't get it cleared through the cosmonaut office, we could not get Sergei nor Vladimir to participate in life sciences experiments that call for you know, taking samples like blood samples, urine samples, things like that. So with the exception of what was absolutely required to assess their health, they didn't participate in any of the life science experiments. The interesting thing is that's a rule that comes from the hierarchy in Roscosmos and from the hierarchy, old time guys in the cosmonaut office. The younger cosmonauts really pleaded and continue to for permission to participate and stuff like that, because they find that life in the Russian segment is really different from life in the U.S. segment, which is the national laboratory. So there's all kinds of vibrant experimentation and stuff going on in the U.S. segment in the national lab. You know, astronauts being, like I was, a phlebotomist, astronauts drawing each other's blood, astronauts doing all this real science and medical stuff, and the cosmonauts in the meantime over here doing experiments nonetheless, but nothing at all that like they really wanted to be able to do. They really wanted to be contributing members of the crew in the life sciences work. But when I was there, I'm not sure whether it's still like that, because I've been gone since 1994. And well, I've been out of the NASA Administrator seat since 2017. And as late as then, we were still trying to figure out a way to allow the two segments to come together so that we truly had an international space station, and not a space station, an international space station with a Russian segment and a US segment.
Did your other crew members on STS-60 have a similar path towards coming to terms with working with the Russians?
You know, you'd have to ask them individually, because we were really diverse. Franklin Chang Diaz, I don't think he gave it a thought. Franklin was born and raised in San Jose, Costa Rica, and came to the US to become an astronaut. You know, he came and spoke no English, so he could identify with everything that they were experiencing as an immigrant. He came here after graduation from high school and enrolled in school at the University of Connecticut and almost flunked out because he couldn't speak English. So he had gone through that kind of battle, only to go on and graduate with honors and then get a PhD in plasma physics from MIT and become one of the world's foremost plasma physicists. So it was a piece of cake for him to adjust. He didn't have any trouble at all. Plus, he has great language skills. So, you know, he just was like a duck in water, picking up Russian and being able to converse with them rudimentarily anyway. I can't think of anybody other than my initial reaction that was the same. Ken Reitler was my pilot, my co-pilot. And Ken was the guy, he was a Navy captain, test pilot, former, you know, experienced astronaut then. But Ken kind of took over as the liaison between the Russians and the Americans. So he was the guy that spearheaded getting the families moved, finding housing, getting them integrated into training. And whereas I was the commander of the crew, Ken was really the guy that did all the hard work of getting them and their families successfully integrated into life in Houston. So we never talked about anybody having the same feelings that they now all know my initial feeling, my initial reaction to being told that I could be their commander, and they forgave me. But I don't think anybody shared my initial feeling about flying with Russians and working.
When you were on the space shuttle, was it a sort of no politics, no global affairs zone,
Not,
or
not at all. Not at all. We talked. It was just like being in. Well, nothing is like today. Today is totally different for the world. But you know, we did not shy away from politics. If somebody had a question they wanted to ask about Putin or anything else, or in fact, it was Gorbachev, and you know, we weren't talking too much about Putin back then. But Shevardnadze was a big name, and he had played a significant role in working with Vice President Gore in bringing about the collaboration between NASA and Roscosmos in the shuttle era. And so one of the things we talked about a lot was tradition, or not tradition, but just operational custom on board. The Russians, just because they were relatively isolated from Earth, they didn't have the kind of communication systems we had at the time. This wasn't early on in shuttle at all, but it was early on enough that the Russians didn't have GPS, so they didn't have they could have access to American systems, but they didn't have their own. We had the tracking and data relay satellite system, so we were in a situation where we had nearly continuous coverage of our flight, no matter what orbit we were in. So for us, it was a pain in the ass because it meant Houston could talk to you and intervene all but about 5 or 10 minutes an hour, which was just a pain. The cosmonauts came from an environment where it was just the opposite. They had maybe 5 or 10 minutes in an orbit when they could talk to the ground because they were still using ground stations for communications. And the difference showed up rudely on the very first day of our flight because Sergei and Franklin were the first to go out, and we had a module in the payload bay that was called the Space Habitation Module. And it was a module that you could live in. It wasn't intended to be lived in at the time, but you could. But it was a module where we did a number of experiments. And it was attached to the crew module with a long tunnel because Space Hab was placed sort of at the back end of the payload bay, and you went through this long tunnel to get to the module. And Franklin and Sergei floated back through the tunnel to open the hatch for the module and bring it to life. And they noticed that there was a duct, an air duct, that ran the length of the tunnel that connected the module itself to the shuttle and to air and electricity and stuff like that. So it was all plumbed to the crew module part of the shuttle way up front. And it had a really bad crimp in it. And we were worried that either that it might crush the cable and air would be cut off from the module, or sufficient fresh air. And so we called the ground's attention to it and said, hey, we've got a really bad crimp in the airline back to the module. And the ground said, stand by, which was typical of Houston. And so we stood by, and days passed, not hours or minutes, but days passed. And several days later, Franklin and Sergei again were doing a tour, and they were narrating this tour of the shuttle and the Hab in Spanish and Russian. And as they went through, they got to the crimp in the line, and they had their 8mm camera, recording all this. And Franklin pointed it at the crimp and got it on tape, and then they brought it back, and we called the ground, and we said, hey, Houston, we just, this crimp in the line that we talked to you all about several days ago, we just thought that it might help if you took a look at it. And so we showed it to him. Almost immediately, this cry came back saying, stand by one, we're working on a solution. And so they came back with some elaborate thing about taking a piece of rubber tubing and everything. And we all looked at that and said, that is the dumbest idea we've ever seen. You're going to replace this semi-rigid line with a piece of rubber tubing, which is just going to collapse on itself immediately. And sure enough, cut off circulation to the Hab. And if we go back to day one, when we saw it, Sergei said, why don't we just fix it? And I said, well, Sergei, we don't have authorization to just fix things, unless it's really a matter of life or death or something like that. he said, we would never do this on Soyuz, on Mir. He said, because the ground isn't there, so we just fix it. And he came up with a solution pretty quickly that very first day, which is what we ended up doing several days later when the ground came back with a really bad plan. All we did was we took the cover of our world atlas. We had a big world atlas, and it had a hard plastic cover on it, clear plastic cover. And so Sergei's idea was just take the plastic cover off the atlas, roll it up into a tube, like a toilet paper tube, take the air hose off the module, and literally stick the rubber, the plastic tube in there, and it would expand out and it would keep it rigid, and we'd be okay. And so that's exact. We had a 10-minute loss of comm with the ground after they sent us their plan, and so we did that in about 5 minutes. And when they came back, we took the Super 8 camera back out and showed it to them. Said, "Hey, here's the solution we came up with. We think everything's okay now." And the ground waited for a little while, and they came back. They said, "Okay, we're happy. Press on and go." But that was a vivid example of the dramatic difference between how you deal with an issue in Russia, at least in space, and how you deal with an issue here in the U.S. And it was, to me, it was interesting because in almost nothing are the cosmonauts allowed to do what they want to do. They're very structured and very strict. Word was when they flew, their training aircraft had limited amount of fuel in it because they did not want them to be able to get out of the Soviet Union, and not take a training like Belenko did way back some time ago when he flew the MiG-23 out of Russia. They didn't want that to ever happen again. So they were very strict. We were pretty loose, with the exception of doing things on the vehicle.
Wow. Did Sergei ever talk about what it was like to be on Mir on that flight when he left the Soviet Union and came back to Russia?
Oh, my guess is he did, and either I don't remember or I wasn't in on the conversation. But Sergei's a very low-key guy, and so whereas an American astronaut might really build it up and talk about what a hero he was, and there I was, at 250 miles above Earth, and all of a sudden I was stranded and everything. But so I don't ever remember Sergei making a big deal of it. He loves St. Petersburg, and although I don't think he had ever lived in St. Petersburg as a person, because he had been born a Soviet, and I think it was always Leningrad to him. But he was incredibly proud of St. Petersburg and wanted all of us to go to his hometown of St. Petersburg because he wanted to show us everything. Some of the other crew got to go. I did not, because our daughter, when we flew and came back, that was my daughter's senior year in high school. And so we had to get her back for graduation. So we took her with us for a week over in Moscow, but then we had to come back. The rest of the crew stayed an extra week and went up to St. Petersburg. And everybody talked about how breathtaking it was.
I lived in St. Petersburg for 9 months during university.
I know. Yeah.
Really loved it. Yeah, it
Yeah.
must have been a really interesting experience for your kids as well, too.
My son missed it for the most part because, like I said, they came in late '93, mid to late '93, and he was a senior at the Naval Academy. So he may have already graduated from the Naval Academy when they got here, and then he went through the Marine Corps Basic School in Quantico. So, and that there was no coming home unless you happen to be there over something like the Christmas holidays. So he had met the Russians, but never really had a chance to get to know them the way that Kelly did, since Kelly was a high school student, and she met Marina, and although Marina was in junior college, they got to know each other, but Kelly was sort of like a big sister to Yuri and to Olga.
What would you say is the sort of lasting impact that the cooperative experience had in you moving forward, especially when you were administrator?
It depends on how you want me to look at it. If I look at it from a world view, my hope, and this is a hope, is that the lasting experience will be more people will will come to see the importance of collaboration and really working hard to find mutually beneficial solutions to problems and issues, to be able to disagree, to try to reach agreement, but if you disagree, to disagree congenially and respectfully, and just agree to disagree, so that we expand that out of the science and engineering realm the way it is right now, to life in general. You know, I had an interesting conversation one morning over coffee with Secretary Kerry in his hotel in Moscow. He had come over. I was in Russia as a part of the post-flight ceremonies and everything for Scott Kelly and his Russian crew member. And Secretary Kerry just happened to be there over that period of time, doing some pretty sensitive negotiations with Foreign Minister Lavrov. And it was typical of the Obama administration. They were not getting along with the Russians at all. And it seemed like every time they met, it was tense. And so the night before Secretary Kerry was due to meet with Scott, he sent me a message, said, "Hey, can you come over for a cup of coffee?" And I didn't know him very well. I wouldn't say he was a friend or anything, but I had worked with him because NASA had supported, he did 2 climate conferences that were just off the page at the State Department during his tenure as Secretary of State. And we had played a key role in putting those on and everything. And so I gotten to know him then. And I'd been in a couple of U.S.-India dialogues with him and everything. So I had great respect for him. And then we had military thing in common. But so I went over for coffee and he said, "Hey, I gotta ask you, how the hell do you do this? You know," and I said, "Mr. Secretary, how do we do what?" He said, "How do you get along with these guys? How do you seem to have such a successful program when we can't do anything down here?" I was up until 1 a.m. with Lavrov going toe to toe, and they're just intransigent, and we just can't figure out what to do. How do you all do it? And I said, I don't have an answer for you, except that we're working on a common mission. We all want to make the world a better place, and we know each other and care for each other. It's personal. Friendships are really important, and when we fly with people, we've been working with them hand in glove for at least a year. It's the same thing with the training teams and the medical people and all that. And so our friendship is most important first of all, and then comes the work. And he said, "Oh, okay, I got it." But that would be my long range worldview goal for what comes out of the collaboration that we've had now for more than 20 years on the International Space Station, plus the time really during the Cold War of Apollo-Soyuz. And Tom Stafford in his latter years of life, he preaches the same thing all the time. And coming from a hardcore military guy like he is viewed, I think it means a lot more than coming from somebody like me that just doesn't know any better.
Do you think that the sort of SpaceX launch of U.S. astronauts, do you think the move away from the Russians launching our astronauts, do you think that's going to change the relationship at all? Or
it can, and it doesn't have to. And when I left, the plan was not to abandon the use of Soyuz as a transportation vehicle. Our plan at the time, and I'm not, because I've been gone almost 4 years now, I'm not sure whether they are sticking with the plan or not. I think they are, but our plan was that we would always have at least one American astronaut who was going to take one for the team and go to Russia for 2 years to train and go to station as a member of the Soyuz crew. But in exchange, we wanted at least one Russian, if not more, come to the United States on